Hello, welcome to another session of The Masked Memoirist. I need to arrange this camera right. I'd like to talk today about the metaphor of fear as represented by masks. Masks like this, which I think represent our fear of catching COVID, and the metaphor of fear as it relates to family and personal history. Today I want to talk about one of my ancestors and how his story, we're not really fearful of talking about this because I've had aunts and uncles that have had no qualms about talking about what a difficult person my grandfather was. But the things that he did were evidently very embarrassing to my aunts and uncles, maybe even to me and my cousins. And we're living with the legacy of some of that fear. So I think the only way to dispel fear is by confronting it and trying to understand it and understand the person who was causing that fear. So today I want to kind of guide you on how we can confront these stories, tell these stories of our ancestors, and come out better people for it and learn things from these stories. First of all, I'm curious as to whether you have accepted the assignment, whether it's given by someone or just taken on by yourself, the assignment of becoming the historian for your family or for your own personal history, because it's a very important role. And I am super thankful that I have relatives who have done this. I've mentioned in a previous broadcast of my Aunt Mary, who did family history research, genealogy at a time when it wasn't very easy to do. And I have my Aunt Jean, who is a wonderful storyteller. I have my Aunt Delora, who has brought me so many family pictures from her albums as she is going through them and trying to get them more organized. And finally, my late Aunt June, and I did not realize this until a few weeks ago when I was looking in my family history, that she had written a story about my grandfather. And it helps explain so much about what kind of person he is and what made him that way. And these are the stories that kind of instill embarrassment occasionally in us, but they also instill admiration and a complete understanding, perhaps, of the kind of person that my grandfather was. I'd like to share with you today something that my aunt wrote on the occasion, I believe, of her 50th anniversary with my Uncle Vernie. And it talks about Grandpa and some of his early life adventures. Noble Glenn Garrett bought a new Indian motorcycle, which he had saved for all his young life, and rode from Kansas to Redwood, California in about 1912. He was the first man ever to ride from Kansas to California on a motorcycle. In every town, people flocked around him and told him so. He carried a skillet and a bedroll and cooked his meals and slept on the trail. Noble worked hard as a lumberjack in the big redwoods. He read that the U.S. was getting close to being involved in a world war. So in August of 1916, he rode his motorcycle back and, as before, camped out. He was one of the first in the area to join up. Noble Glenn Garrett and his younger brother Jack joined the U.S. Army on April 1st, 1917. Jack was only 17 years old and Noble was 24, So Noble had to sign for Jack, but the Army later learned that Uncle Jack was only 17, so they didn't send him overseas. Dad went overseas and went in the Army as a musician, an excellent trombone player, and he played in many parades, many Army parades. His job description was in for a big change when his division was sent to the battlefront, where he was assigned a new Harley-Davidson motorcycle and was selected to be a messenger to deliver orders from the Army officers back to the bunkers in the battlefront where the soldiers were often surrounded. Dad would help fight the Germans. One soldier loading a cannon was shot next to Dad, so Dad pitched in, loading the larger cannon shells. One shell backfired and exploded, shattering Dad's right eardrum. He could never hear in that ear again. Noble was delivering a message back to the bunkers one cold, rainy night after a big battle in France when a German sniper shot him through his right knee. He nearly wiped out from the impact, but knew that his message must get through because many of his buddies were surrounded. As he rode on in the cold with his leg getting numb, blood was dripping down into his high boot, but he made it, and was told later that he saved many lives that night. The Germans put mustard gas in many of their cannon shells, and when they exploded, the gas would burn the soldiers' lungs, eyes, and skin. The burns never healed completely, and Dad suffered the after effects all of his life. Well, Dad did make it back in 1919 and met a beautiful single lady at an adult Sunday school party. And that was my grandmother, Julia. And they had their children, and then the 30s hit, and there were 6 kids. By 1939, there were 9 children. Dad did work them hard and late. He always said he was trying to keep the wolf away from the door. The more he expanded his farming business, the harder he drove his family, his kids and wife. It became an obsession for him to succeed. He was so busy making a living that he forgot to live. But he did have his tender moments. My Aunt June saw him pick up a duck and hug it, and swears tears rolled down his face when his grandmother Robbins died. As my aunts grew older, my aunts and uncles, they understood the tough times that he and their dear mother went through, the drought and depression. Their mother cared and loved for them very dearly, so her love balanced the scale because Grandpa was, he'd go off and get drunk and disappear for days. He was known to consort with women in bars and spend a lot of time at their houses. So my aunts and uncles grew up with a legacy of dysfunction, I guess. And some of my cousins and myself have kind of inherited some of that dysfunction, but we've also inherited other more positive legacies. For example, his music. He played the trombone. My grandmother played the piano. And I developed a love of music early on. And my son, ironically, played trombone in his high school band. So there are positive and negative things about our ancestors that we can recognize that we have acquired somehow, either through DNA or just through family traditions. But we shouldn't shy away from examining the good and the bad because it brings us to a better understanding of ourselves. So we need to kind of adopt a philosophy that even though our family background might have a lot of embarrassing people in it, embarrassing moments, embarrassing history, it helps us know who we are, who we've come from. So I would urge you all to consider the stories of your family and even your own from the perspective of perhaps an investigative journalist. What can you learn from them? How can you how can you or how have you done better? How have you done differently? Have you managed to break any cycles of dysfunction or addiction, for example? If you do, I think you will find that you have confronted your fears, fears of embarrassment, fears of knowing the truth, and you will realize that you are a much better person for having taken the time to investigate your family history, your own history, and learned from it. So I would urge you all to do that. Consider taking on this assignment as your family's historian. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you in next week's edition of The Masked Memoirist.